He kicked her out while she was pregnant, leaving her with nothing but heartbreak and a growing child. 20 years later, the son he abandoned walked into his office and turned his world upside down. This is a raw, emotional journey of betrayal, survival, and ultimate redemption that will leave you speechless by the end. Where are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that stay with you long after the screen fades. It was a bitterly cold evening in Manhattan, the kind of night where the city lights looked like frozen stars against the glass of the high-rise towers. From the penthouse window, Central Park glimmered below, a darkened stretch of frost-bitten trees under a silver sky. Inside the Lancaster residence, the warmth of a crackling fireplace couldn't quite melt the ice forming in Claire Donovan's chest. She stood by the hearth, twisting the hem of her cashmere sweater with trembling fingers, trying to summon the courage that had failed her every night for the past week. Her heart thudded beneath her ribs as if it, too, were trying to escape this moment. Gregory Lancaster sat across the room in his favorite leather armchair, one leg crossed over the other, the scent of aged scotch curling in the air around him. His fingers lazily traced the rim of his crystal glass. He didn't look up, not even when she stepped forward and said his name. Gregory. He murmured, eyes still fixed on the glowing screen of his phone. I need to tell you something, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That made him pause. He finally lifted his eyes, piercing and unreadable. Then tell me. Claire swallowed the lump rising in her throat. I'm pregnant. The words hovered in the air for a heartbeat too long. He didn't blink, didn't react, just stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. Then slowly a smile curved across his lips. But it wasn't the kind of smile that softened. It was sharp, mocking, cold. Pregnant, he echoed, as if tasting the word. Claire felt her stomach twist. She had imagined this so many times. He'd pull her into his arms, whisper how happy he was, how they were going to build a life together. But now she realized she had been dreaming about a man who didn't exist. I suppose, Gregory said, setting his glass down with a soft clink, you expect me to believe that child is mine. Her mouth dropped open. Gregory, what? Of course it's yours. We've been married for 3 years. I haven't been with anyone else. He stood abruptly, towering over her, his presence suddenly suffocating. My mother warned me about you from the beginning. Said you were after my money. I should have listened. Claire flinched like she'd been slapped. You think this was a trap? That I planned this to get your money? He laughed, bitter and humorless. Isn't that what women like you do? You see a wealthy man, wrap yourself around him, then pop out a kid and lock him down. Her vision blurred with tears. You don't mean this. I absolutely do, he snapped. You've been getting too comfortable, thinking this apartment, this life, makes you untouchable. But let me remind you, Claire, you brought nothing into this marriage. Nothing. And you'll leave with nothing. He crossed to the desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out his checkbook. The pen in his hand moved with calculated ease. Claire stood frozen, each breath a razor in her throat. He tore the check and extended it to her. Here, more than enough for a new start. Claire looked at the number. 6 figures. It should have shocked her. Instead, it made her sick. You think I can be bought? She whispered. You think I'd trade my child for money? Gregory's face hardened. I think you need to leave. I have nowhere to go, she said, her voice shaking. Not my problem. Claire stared at the man she had once loved. This wasn't a bad day. This wasn't stress. This was who he really was. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she turned and walked down the hallway to the bedroom they once shared. She packed a small bag, some clothes, her passport, her journal. Her hands shook as she zipped it shut. Every corner of the apartment felt colder now. The framed photos of vacations, the books they'd read together, the life she thought they were building. Lies, all of it. When she stepped back into the living room, Gregory stood by the door, arms crossed, his face devoid of remorse. Don't ever come back, he said. Claire said nothing. She didn't beg, didn't scream. She simply walked past him and into the elevator, the echo of his words clinging to her like smoke. Outside, the city was alive with noise, honking taxis, chattering pedestrians, steam rising from sewer grates. But Claire felt like she was standing in a vacuum. Her coat did little to block the icy wind that sliced through her as she stepped onto Fifth Avenue. She had no plan. No friends nearby. Her parents were gone. Her only family lived halfway across the country. And now, she was alone. Broke. Pregnant. She wandered the city like a ghost, drawn by the lights but untouched by their glow. At one point, she found herself staring into the window of a children's boutique. A tiny pair of knitted booties sat in the display, the price tag mocking her. She pressed a hand to her belly, not yet swollen but heavy with the weight of new life. "I'll take care of you," she whispered, "no matter what." She kept walking. Blocks blurred. Hours passed. Eventually she landed at the bus terminal. Her feet were aching, her fingers numb. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a pale, clinical glow. People bustled past her, families, travelers, lovers returning home. Claire moved to the ticket counter. "I need a ticket to Cleveland," she said softly. The clerk tapped a few keys. "One way or round trip?" "One way," she replied. "That'll be $108. She opened her purse. Nothing. No cash. No cards that weren't tied to Gregory. No line of credit. Just some loose change and a lipstick. Panic rose in her throat. She turned away, leaned against a pillar, and closed her eyes. Her pride screamed at her to stay silent. But her child deserved more. With shaking hands, she approached a middle-aged woman in a red coat. "Excuse me," Claire said, her voice barely audible. "I'm in a really difficult situation. I need to get to Cleveland. I'm pregnant, and I don't have the money for a bus ticket. If you could spare anything." The woman's eyes darted away. "I'm sorry," she mumbled and walked off. Claire tried again, and again. Each rejection chipped away at her dignity, until finally she turned to leave. Then, "Hey," she looked up. A man in his 60s stood a few feet away. Tall, thin, with kind eyes and rough hands. He nodded at her belly. "Cleveland, huh? I grew up there." She nodded, unsure what to say. He reached into his wallet without hesitation and pulled out exact change. "I've been there," he said simply. "Just promise me you'll pay it forward someday." Claire's eyes welled with tears. "I will. Thank you. Thank you so much." An hour later, she was on the bus, forehead resting against the cold window, watching the lights of New York fade into the distance. She didn't know what waited in Cleveland. She didn't know if Marie would take her in, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel completely hopeless. She still had nothing. But she wasn't giving up. Not tonight. Not ever. The Greyhound bus hummed softly beneath Claire's seat as it rumbled westward, away from everything she had ever known. Through the frosted window, she watched the lights of New Jersey dissolve into darkness, her reflection ghosted faintly against the glass. She barely recognized the woman looking back, hair disheveled, eyes red-rimmed from crying, shoulders hunched beneath a borrowed coat. It had been less than 12 hours since her world collapsed, and already it felt like another lifetime. The farther they drove, the quieter the passengers became. Some slept, heads pressed awkwardly against the window. Others stared blankly ahead, lost in their own troubles. Claire sat still, hands folded protectively over her stomach, listening to the low murmurs of the road. Her mind churned with memories she tried to suppress. Gregory's cold smile, the feel of the check in her hand, the sharp slam of the penthouse door. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes. The seat creaked beneath her weight, and for the first time in weeks, she let herself breathe. Not because she was safe, not because she knew what came next, but because she had done the unthinkable. Walked away from the man she had once believed would love her forever. Somewhere around dawn, the bus stopped at a gas station diner. Claire stepped off to stretch her legs, the Ohio air biting her skin. Her stomach growled as she passed racks of bagged chips and plastic-wrapped sandwiches, but she kept her eyes forward. She had no money, not even for a coffee. Inside the restroom, she splashed cold water on her face, trying to rinse away the weight of the night. When she returned to her seat, she noticed someone had left a banana and a granola bar on her tray table. No note, just kindness. Her eyes stung again, but she smiled softly and whispered, "Thank you," to the universe. By mid-morning, the Cleveland skyline emerged from the horizon. A patchwork of brick buildings, smokestacks, and church spires nestled beneath a dull, wintry sky. It wasn't New York. It didn't glimmer or intimidate, but there was something grounded about it. Humble. Quiet. A city that didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. Claire stepped off the bus at the terminal with her single duffel bag and a crumpled scrap of paper with Marie's last known address. They hadn't spoken in nearly 5 years. Their lives had taken different paths after college. Marie stayed in Cleveland, teaching high school English, while Claire chased Gregory's glittering promises through Manhattan. But Marie had always been kind, thoughtful, real. Claire flagged down a cab with the last of her cash. The driver was a middle-aged man with a gentle accent and reggae music playing softly through the speakers. He didn't ask questions when she handed him the paper, just nodded and said, "Got it." They drove through neighborhoods that bore the weight of time. Small houses with peeling shutters, porches strewn with faded holiday lights, narrow streets lined with slush. Claire's heart pounded with every block. What if Marie had moved? What if she wasn't home? What if she opened the door and didn't recognize the woman standing there? When the cab pulled up to a modest brick apartment building in a quiet stretch of Lakewood, Claire hesitated. The windows were lit from inside. A bike leaned against the railing. It looked lived in. "Here, okay?" the driver asked. Claire nodded. "Yeah." She handed him a handful of coins. He took them without complaint, then offered her a quiet, "Good luck." She stood at the door for a full minute before knocking. Her breath fogged in the air. Her fingers trembled, half from cold, half from fear. Seconds passed, then the door creaked open. Marie? Her hair was shorter than Claire remembered, but her face hadn't changed. Freckles, warm brown eyes, that familiar worried crease between her brows. "Claire?" Marie breathed, like she was seeing a ghost. Claire's voice broke. "I didn't know where else to go." Marie stared at her, really looked at her, at the exhaustion in her posture, the duffel bag at her feet, the way her coat clung to a softly rounded belly. Without hesitation, she stepped forward and pulled Claire into a hug. "Come inside," she whispered. The warmth of the apartment wrapped around Claire like a blanket. It smelled like cinnamon and fresh coffee. The living room was cozy, bookshelves crammed with novels, mismatched throw pillows on the couch, a crocheted blanket folded over the armrest. Marie led her to the sofa and handed her a mug of something hot. Claire took it with both hands, letting the steam rise into her face. "Tell me everything," Marie said gently. And so she did. She told her about Gregory, about the pregnancy, about the cold way he dismissed her, the check he tried to buy her off with. She told her about wandering the streets, the stranger who paid for her bus ticket, the ache in her feet, the terror in her chest. Marie listened without interrupting, her expression a mixture of disbelief and anger. When Claire finally fell silent, voice hoarse and eyes hollow, Marie reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You're staying here," she said firmly. No arguments. Claire's eyes welled again. "I can't ask you to. You didn't. I offered. And you're not just anyone, Claire, you're family." The next few days passed in a blur of blankets, warm meals, and sleep. Claire's body, running on fumes for days, finally gave in. She slept like the dead. And when she woke, Marie was there, with breakfast or tea or just quiet company. Gradually, Claire started to move again. She showered. She wrote in her journal. She started researching jobs, anything that would give her stability. One afternoon, as they sat together folding laundry, Marie said, "There's a little diner a few blocks from here. I think they're hiring. It's not glamorous, but it's a start." Claire nodded. A start was all she needed. She dressed in her cleanest clothes, smoothed her hair back, and walked to the diner with her resume in hand. Her knees wobbled with every step. It felt like walking into battle. Even though it was just a corner restaurant with peeling linoleum floors and the smell of frying bacon in the air. The owner, a woman in her late 50s named Donna, eyed Claire over the top of her glasses. "You ever waitressed before?" she asked. "No," Claire admitted, "but I'm a fast learner, and I really need this job." Donna studied her for a long beat, then handed her an apron. "Morning shift, don't be late." Claire nearly cried with relief. That night, she sat with Marie at the kitchen table, her eyes shining. "I got it," Marie beamed. "Told you. One step at a time." Claire placed a hand over her stomach. For the first time since leaving New York, she allowed herself to smile, not just because she had survived, but because she had begun to live again. Claire's first shift at the diner began before the sun even rose. The sky outside was still wrapped in a dark, early morning hush as she buttoned up her second-hand uniform and tied her apron around her waist. Her hands trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from the weight of it all. This wasn't just a job. It was survival. A lifeline. the first step in reclaiming herself from the ruins Gregory had left behind. Donna, the diner's gruff but fair owner, gave Claire a quick tour of the kitchen and prep station. "Coffee pots are your best friends," she barked. "Keep 'em full, keep 'em hot, and keep the regulars happy. They tip decent if you smile and remember how they like their eggs." Claire nodded, memorizing everything like her life depended on it. Because in many ways it did. The regulars trickled in just after 5. Truckers in flannel jackets, retired factory workers with stories that never seemed to end, and exhausted nurses coming off overnight shifts. They took to Claire quickly, mostly because she listened, really listened, and didn't pretend to be anything she wasn't. She didn't have the sharp sass of the other waitresses or the breezy confidence that came from years in the job, but what she lacked in experience, she made up for in quiet resilience. And people noticed. At first, the shifts were grueling. Her feet ached, her lower back screamed from standing for hours. By the end of her first week, her legs felt like lead, and sleep came the second her head hit the pillow. But every night, she'd lie in bed at Marie's apartment, her hands resting on the gentle curve of her belly, and whisper to the child growing inside her, "We're okay. We're going to be okay." She meant it more with each passing day. Marie, true to her word, remained Claire's anchor. She never made her feel like a burden. She didn't offer pity, just presence. Some evenings after long shifts, they'd sit on the couch in their pajamas, sipping peppermint tea and watching reruns of old sitcoms. It was simple, warm, and healing in a way that words never could be. But Claire knew she couldn't stay in this comfort zone forever. She had to build something more, not just for herself, but for her child. The cost of diapers, checkups, a crib, it all added up faster than she'd expected. Her savings, what little she'd scraped together from tips, was barely enough to cover essentials. She began skimming local bulletin boards and library postings for programs that might help. One flyer caught her eye: free career training for single mothers, Chicago Women's Resource Center. Claire circled the number and made the call. That week, she walked into the small brick building downtown and met Linda, a counselor with salt and pepper hair and a voice like honey-coated gravel. "You're not the first to come in scared," Linda said, offering a cup of coffee. "And you sure won't be the last." Claire explained her situation, how she had no degree, no connections, just a high school diploma and a burning need to build a future. Linda listened, nodded thoughtfully, then slid a packet across the desk. "This program trains medical office assistants. It's short, it's certified, and it opens doors. It won't be easy, but if you're serious..." Claire didn't hesitate. "I'm serious." And so began the next phase of her transformation. Her days grew fuller than ever. Morning shifts at the diner, afternoons at the resource center, evening classes in basic medical terminology, scheduling software, patient confidentiality, and somehow, in between, she squeezed in prenatal appointments and quick naps when she could. She learned to live without. No more new clothes, no takeout, no indulgences. Every dollar went into her emergency fund or the baby's future. Marie helped with meals and sometimes with rent, though Claire always insisted on paying her share, even if it meant counting every penny. There were days when the exhaustion was bone deep, when her back felt like it might split in half and her eyelids fluttered mid-shift. But she never quit, not once. Because every time she felt like breaking, she'd remember Gregory's face the night he told her she was nothing. That her child was a mistake. That she had no place in his world. She'd prove him wrong with every single step she took. Donna began to notice her work ethic too. One night, after the diner had closed, she slid a wrapped sandwich across the counter. "You work harder than anyone I've seen in years," she said, lighting a cigarette. "I don't know what that guy did to you, but keep going. You're the kind that makes it." Claire blinked back tears. "Thank you." Donna shrugged. "Just don't let it go to your head. Table 5 still hates lukewarm coffee." That fall, Claire began to show. Just a little at first, a soft roundness under her apron that earned curious glances and sometimes unexpected kindness. Regulars started leaving a bit more in tips. One of the nurses brought in a box of baby clothes her own child had outgrown. Even gruff old Benny, the retired steelworker, grunted, "Hope it's a boy, girls will break your heart," then handed her a gift card to the local grocery store. There were hard days, too, the occasional rude customer who made a snide remark. The moments in class when her mind would drift and she'd feel panic rise in her chest. What if she couldn't do this? What if she failed again? But then she'd come home, see the worn sonogram picture on her nightstand, and find her footing again. She passed her final exams just 2 weeks before her due date. Linda hugged her tight when she got the certificate. "You're going to be one hell of a mom," she said. Claire smiled, resting her hand on her belly. "I already am." That night, she walked home slowly through the early winter streets, snowflakes drifting in the orange glow of the street lamps. Her boots crunched softly on the pavement. She paused on the stoop of Marie's building and looked up at the sky. It was the same sky she had stared at the night Gregory threw her out, but it felt different now. Then suddenly, she felt it. A flutter, low in her belly. She froze, hand pressed instinctively to her bump. There it was again, a kick. Her baby's first true hello. She gasped, eyes wide, as joy surged through her chest, pure and fierce. In that instant, everything she had endured, the betrayal, the cold nights, the exhaustion, the fear, it all faded beneath the quiet miracle of that tiny movement. She whispered, "You're really in there, aren't you?" And for the first time in a long, long time, Claire Donovan didn't feel alone. She felt powerful. Ready. Unstoppable. The night Claire went into labor, the wind howled outside Marie's apartment like it had a soul of its own. The city streets were slick with icy rain, and Claire had just finished folding a small stack of baby clothes when the first real contraction hit. It wasn't like the false ones she'd felt before. This one stole her breath and curled her over the edge of the bed, hands clenching the blanket as a gasp escaped her lips. Marie found her moments later in the hallway, gripping the wall, pale and wide-eyed. "It's time," Claire whispered, her voice a mix of fear and awe. Marie didn't panic. She grabbed the hospital bag they'd packed a week ago, helped Claire into her coat, and hailed a cab like she'd rehearsed this moment 100 times. The driver barely had time to ask, "Which hospital?" before they were off, tires slicing through the wet pavement toward Northwestern Memorial. Claire clutched Marie's hand the entire ride, her other resting over her belly, whispering soft reassurances to the child within. "You've held on this long," she murmured. "We're almost there." The hospital was bright, sterile, and humming with low chatter. Nurses moved efficiently, and the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and peppermint soap. Claire was wheeled into a delivery room within minutes. Marie never left her side, holding her hand through each surge of pain, whispering calm into the chaos. Hours passed in a blur of contractions, beeping monitors, and focused breathing. At one point, when exhaustion threatened to pull her under, Claire heard the doctor say, "One more push." She gritted her teeth, summoned everything she had left, and gave the last push all the strength her body could offer. And then, a cry. A sharp, high-pitched, glorious wail that shattered the room in the most beautiful way. Claire collapsed back onto the bed, tears streaming down her cheeks as the doctor held up a tiny, red-faced baby boy. "It's a boy," the nurse said gently, swaddling him and placing him in Claire's trembling arms. Claire looked down into his face, eyes scrunched tight, fists balled up, lungs already fierce. Her heart cracked open in ways she didn't know were possible. "Hi, Leo," she whispered. "It's you. It's really you." He quieted the second he heard her voice, like he knew her all along. Marie stood beside her, misty-eyed, brushing a strand of hair from Claire's damp forehead. "He's perfect," she said. Claire nodded, unable to speak, just rocking slightly, overwhelmed by love, by relief, by the quiet triumph of this moment. She had made it. They had made it. The first few weeks were a haze of sleepless nights, soft lullabies, and late-night feedings under the warm glow of a nightlight. Marie helped as much as she could, warming bottles, walking the floor with Leo when Claire needed a moment to cry, or sleep, or just breathe. But most of it fell to Claire, and she embraced it all. The midnight cries, the spit-up-stained shirts, the deep, bone-weary exhaustion, because every second was worth it. Each coo, each tiny yawn, each flutter of his eyelashes as he drifted off in her arms. It all filled the hollow places Gregory had left behind. Claire found work quickly after her 6-week recovery. The certificate from the medical assistant training helped her land an entry-level job at a pediatric clinic in Lincoln Park. It was part-time to start, just 3 days a week, but it paid more than the diner and offered a future she could actually see herself in. Her supervisor, a kind woman named Dr. Ramirez, took an immediate liking to her. "You've got a calm presence," she said one afternoon as Claire helped soothe a crying toddler. "That's rare in this job." Claire smiled. "I've had some practice lately." The clinic became more than a workplace. It was a step toward stability, toward building something lasting. Claire quickly became a favorite among parents, gentle with the children, respectful with the staff, always eager to learn. She stayed late to organize files, asked questions during lunch breaks, and took notes like her life depended on it. Because it did. Back at home, Marie continued to be her rock. She helped babysit when Claire was at work and never complained when the nights were loud and the days were long. Their apartment, small, cluttered, and often noisy, became a haven of love and laughter. Leo grew fast. At 6 months, he was babbling and rolling over with determination. At 9, he took his first steps, wobbling across the living room into Claire's open arms as she burst into joyful tears. By his first birthday, he had a mischievous grin and a habit of pointing at everything with wide-eyed wonder. Claire threw him a party in the park, nothing fancy, just a picnic blanket, a homemade cake, and a few friends from the clinic. But as she watched Leo smash frosting into his hair while giggling uncontrollably, she felt like the richest woman in the world. One night, long after Leo had fallen asleep on her chest, Claire sat on the couch with Marie, sipping tea. The glow from the TV flickered across their faces as they watched an old film neither of them had the energy to follow. "You've built a life," Marie said softly. "You should be proud." Claire looked down at her son's sleeping face and nodded. "I am." She no longer thought of Gregory every day. At first, it had been impossible not to. His voice, his betrayal, the finality of his cruelty, it had haunted her in quiet moments. But over time, those memories faded like smoke. They no longer held power over her. She had found strength in the places he tried to break. She had created joy where he left emptiness. She had learned to love, really love, in the way he never could. And every time Leo reached up for her, or called her name with his sweet, bubbly voice, she knew that she had chosen the right path. The harder one. The lonelier one. But the one paved with truth and grit and unconditional devotion. Years passed quietly but steadily. Claire moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment closer to the clinic. She enrolled in additional certification classes on weekends and worked full-time once Leo started preschool. She and Marie remained close, though Marie eventually moved in with her longtime partner across town. Their bond, however, never changed. It had been forged in crisis, sealed with loyalty, and cemented by shared purpose. Claire didn't date much. There wasn't time, and truthfully, she didn't feel the need. Her life was full. Demanding, yes, but full of the kind of meaning that came from showing up day after day, even when no one was watching, even when no one else clapped. She didn't need a man to complete her. She had Leo, and he was everything. By the time Leo turned 5, he was reading simple books, asking impossible questions about the stars, and offering his mother flowers made of weeds and dandelions from the sidewalk. Claire had saved every drawing, every note, every handmade birthday card. She kept them in a box under her bed. Her proof that love, real love, wasn't about diamonds or penthouses or dinner parties with CEOs. It was about this: small hands in hers, laughter in the kitchen, hope on the other side of hardship. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset from the fire escape, Leo rested his head on her shoulder. "Mom," he said, "when I grow up, I want to help people. Like you." Claire blinked, heart swelling. She wrapped her arm around him and kissed his forehead. "You already do, baby," she whispered. "More than you'll ever know." Claire never expected peace to arrive in such quiet, steady waves. It didn't come with grand declarations or life-changing moments. It arrived in the clink of morning coffee cups, in the sound of Leo's giggles echoing through their tiny apartment, in the way the sunlight filtered through sheer curtains as she packed his lunch for school. Her life had shape now, solid, purposeful, and, for the first time, safe. She'd been working full-time at the Lincoln Park Pediatric Clinic for nearly 3 years. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. The staff respected her, parents trusted her, and the children adored her. Her days were filled with check-in forms, immunization charts, and the constant hum of little voices calling her Miss Claire with sticky fingers and wide eyes. And she loved every second of it. Leo, now almost 8, was thriving in second grade. He had his mother's patience and quiet thoughtfulness, but his father's striking blue eyes, a fact Claire tried not to dwell on too much. The resemblance was startling sometimes, especially when Leo stared off in deep thought or tilted his head the same way Gregory used to during business calls. But that's where the similarity ended. Leo was kind, generous, curious in a way that made Claire believe, despite everything, that goodness had won out. They had moved into a new apartment last year, a 2-bedroom unit in a modest but friendly neighborhood. It wasn't much, but the walls were painted in warm tones, the furniture was hand-picked from thrift stores and flea markets, and every inch of it whispered of home. Claire had decorated Leo's room with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling and built him a little reading nook by the window. Her room was simpler, quieter, just a soft bed, a sturdy dresser, and a framed photo of the two of them at the zoo on Leo's 4th birthday. Sometimes when she had a moment to herself, usually after dinner when Leo was in his pajamas reading aloud from whatever adventure book he was into that week, Claire would look around and feel something she hadn't let herself feel for years. Pride. She had built this. Not just the home or the job, but the life, the wholeness, the sense of safety and routine. And she had done it on her own, with no help from the man who once claimed she was nothing. She didn't talk about Gregory. Not to Leo, not to Marie, not even to herself in those dark, late-night hours when old wounds sometimes reopened in dreams. Leo had asked once when he was 5, "Mom, do I have a dad?" Claire had taken a deep breath and told him the truth, or at least the part of it he could understand. "You do," she'd said gently, stroking his hair. "But he made a choice not to be part of our lives, and that's okay, because families can look all kinds of ways." Leo had nodded with the easy acceptance only children have. Then he'd smiled and said, "I'm glad I have you." That was enough. Claire never regretted her decision not to chase Gregory down or demand child support. Maybe it would have helped financially, but she would have paid the price emotionally. He had slammed the door shut on their lives, and she had never once looked back. She had poured everything into raising Leo right, and that meant shielding him from the poison of a man who valued money more than people. Still, there were moments when he'd cross her mind unexpectedly, like the time she saw his name in a finance magazine left in the waiting room at the clinic. Gregory Lancaster, real estate tycoon, reshaping Manhattan. His face stared up at her from the glossy page. Older, a little grayer, but still exuding that same smug confidence she remembered. Claire had torn the page out and thrown it in the trash. Or the time Leo brought home a school project, a family tree. Claire had helped him fill it out, navigating the blank spots with care. "Just write unknown there," she'd said gently, pointing to the father branch. Leo, perceptive as always, looked at her and said, "You're both my branches." Her throat had tightened, but she smiled. "Then, it's the strongest tree in the world." As the years passed, Claire began to look at herself differently. Not as someone who had been abandoned, but as someone who had risen. She found confidence in small victories. When a patient thanked her for making their child laugh during shots, when she paid off her last credit card, when Leo aced a science test and whispered, "I did it for you, Mom." She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. On weekends, they'd take the bus to the lake and feed ducks. Sometimes they'd visit Marie, now happily married to her partner Anna, who always had cookies waiting and a new book recommendation for Leo. Other times they'd just stay home and build blanket forts, the sound of Leo's laughter filling every room like music. Claire often found herself watching him from the doorway. How tall he was getting, how sharp his mind was, how his whole face lit up when he talked about planets or dragons or building a rocket ship someday. He was becoming a person, not just her baby, not just the child she had fought to protect, but a full human being with dreams and fears and jokes that actually made her laugh. One Saturday afternoon, as they were walking home from the library, Leo asked, "Mom, if someone hurts you but never says sorry, can you still forgive them?" Claire looked down at him, surprised. "That's a big question," she said slowly. "Where'd that come from?" Leo shrugged. "A book I read. The character's dad left, and he came back, but never said sorry. Claire nodded, her heart beating a little faster. Well, sometimes people hurt others because they're scared or selfish, and sometimes they never admit it, but forgiveness isn't really for them. It's for you. Leo frowned. How? Because if you carry around all that anger, it gets heavy. Forgiving someone doesn't mean what they did was okay. It just means you're not letting it control you anymore. He was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then he nodded. I think I'd want to forgive, so I can keep flying. Claire smiled, blinking back tears. Yeah, baby, that's exactly it. As they walked the rest of the way home, Claire felt something shift deep inside her. She had spent so many years building walls, protecting Leo, proving Gregory wrong in every possible way. But now, maybe it was time to let go of what still lingered. Not because Gregory deserved it, but because she and Leo deserved better than carrying his shadow. That night, as Leo slept curled beside her on the couch, book still open on his chest, socks mismatched, cheeks flushed from laughter, Claire whispered softly to herself, I forgive you. And with those 3 quiet words, something long buried cracked open and drifted away like a leaf on water. It was time, not to forget, but to be free. It happened on a warm spring afternoon, the kind of day where the sun feels like an old friend and the breeze carries laughter from open cafe patios. Claire had just gotten off work early and decided to meet Leo near his new school in Manhattan. He'd recently been accepted into Columbia University on a merit scholarship, one of only 3 in the state, and though she tried to play it cool, Claire still caught herself beaming every time she told someone. They had agreed to meet at a nearby park, but Leo texted last minute, running a little late, walking around a bit, something I want to check out. Claire didn't think much of it. Her son had always been curious, always asking questions no one else dared to ask. What she didn't know was that his curiosity had a name that afternoon, Gregory Lancaster. Leo had walked these city blocks 100 times before, but today, his feet led him with a different purpose. He hadn't planned it. It wasn't in his schedule. He didn't even know what he'd say if the moment came. But there it was, Lancaster Holdings. The name shimmered in tall gold letters above the revolving doors of a towering glass skyscraper. Leo stood across the street for nearly 10 minutes, backpack slung over one shoulder, thumb absently tapping his phone screen. He could walk away. He could pretend this didn't matter. But deep down, it did. It always had. He crossed the street, every step heavier than the last. The marble floors inside the lobby gleamed under the high ceilings. The receptionist, a sleek woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a sharper tone, looked up from her desk. Do you have an appointment? Leo shook his head. No, but I need to see Gregory Lancaster. Her brows arched, professional and cautious. And you are? He hesitated. Then the words came out like a dam breaking. I'm his son. She blinked, caught off guard, and for a moment her mask slipped. But only for a moment. She picked up the phone, spoke quietly, then nodded toward a seating area. Wait here. Leo sat on the edge of a leather chair, his knees bouncing, trying to steady his breath. Minutes passed like hours. Then a man in a black suit approached, tall, broad-shouldered, unmistakably security. Mr. Lancaster will see you now. Leo stood, legs stiff, and followed him through glass corridors and polished hallways until they reached a large wooden door. The office was as impressive as Leo expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows, shelves lined with books no one read, and a massive desk that looked like it belonged in a courtroom. Behind it stood Gregory Lancaster, older than the photos Leo had seen online, but still every bit the image of success. Gregory looked up, expression unreadable. His icy blue eyes met Leo's, and for a long moment, nothing was said. Then flatly, "Who are you?" Leo stepped forward, pulse pounding in his ears. "My name is Leo Donovan. I'm your son." Gregory didn't flinch, didn't react, just stared. Then, without emotion, he said, "I don't have a son." Leo's jaw clenched. "You do. You just didn't stick around long enough to meet him." Gregory stood slowly, walking around the desk with deliberate calm. "Emily Donovan," he said, almost to himself. "My mother," Leo confirmed. "The woman you threw out when she told you she was pregnant. The one who built a life without you, who raised me without a single cent from you." Gregory rubbed his jaw. "She never contacted me." "She didn't need to," Leo snapped. "She had pride, and she had me. We didn't need you." but I came here because I need to understand how someone could just walk away." There was a long pause. Gregory turned to the window, staring out at the city. "I was young, ambitious. I had a company to run, an empire to build. I wasn't ready." Leo took a step closer. "And you think that excuses it? You weren't ready, so you left us on the street? My mom begged you to listen. She loved you, and you gave her a check and told her to disappear." Gregory didn't respond. The silence between them was deafening. "I didn't come here to ask for money," Leo continued, his voice quieter now, "or an apology. I just wanted to look you in the eye and say I became everything you didn't believe I could be. And I did it without your name, your help, or your damn money." Gregory turned, finally facing him. There was something, just a flicker in his eyes. Regret? Recognition? Leo couldn't tell. "You're angry," Gregory said softly. "No," Leo said, surprising even himself. "I'm not angry. I used to be. But now I'm just done." He turned to leave, but Gregory spoke again. "What does your mother think about you being here?" Leo paused, hand on the doorknob. "She doesn't know, but I think she stopped thinking about you a long time ago." He walked out without waiting for a reply. Outside, the city had changed. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Leo exhaled, his chest lighter than it had been in years. He didn't get closure. Not really. But he got clarity, and maybe for now, that was enough. Claire noticed it the moment she saw him at the park. "You okay?" she asked as they sat on a bench, watching the ducks glide across the pond. Leo nodded. "Yeah, I did something I needed to do." Claire studied him for a moment. "You saw him, didn't you?" Leo didn't answer, but he didn't have to. Claire looked away, lips pressed tight. "Was he what you expected?" "Worse," Leo said. "Not because he yelled or denied it, because he didn't feel anything, like we were just a small inconvenience in the corner of his life." Claire's throat tightened, but she didn't speak. "I thought maybe he'd have questions, or say something human. But he didn't, and weirdly, I think I needed that, to see that it wasn't about me, it was about him, his fear, his ego." Claire reached over and placed her hand over his. "You're nothing like him," she whispered. "You never were." They sat in silence for a while, the city murmuring around them. Leo finally turned to her. "Thanks for never letting me feel unwanted." Claire's eyes shimmered, but she smiled. "You've always been the best part of my life." That night, Leo wrote in his journal, something he rarely shared. Just one line. "I met my father today," and walked away feeling more like my mother's son than ever. He closed the notebook, turned off the lamp, and let sleep come. Not heavy and troubled like before, but light and quiet, like a door softly closing on a chapter that no longer needed to be reopened. A year passed after Leo's confrontation with Gregory Lancaster, and life returned to its quiet rhythm. Claire continued her work at the pediatric clinic, and Leo thrived at Columbia, splitting his time between classes, student council, and tutoring underserved teens in Harlem. They still called each other every Sunday night, no matter how busy life got. Claire would ask about his professors, his projects, and whether he was sleeping enough. Leo would always ask about the clinic, the neighborhood, and whether she was remembering to treat herself every now and then. They didn't talk about Gregory again. Until the call came. It was a gray Thursday morning, and Claire was preparing a tray of vaccines when her phone vibrated in her coat pocket. She glanced at the number, unknown. Normally, she would have ignored it, but something in her chest tugged. She excused herself and stepped into the break room. "Hello?" There was a pause, then a low, gravelly voice she hadn't heard in nearly 2 decades. "Claire?" Her breath caught. The room tilted just slightly. "Gregory?" "Yes." She waited, heart thundering, throat tight. No one called her from the past. That world was closed, buried, untouchable. "I wouldn't call unless it mattered," he said, his voice hollowed out by something that didn't sound like power anymore. "I'm sick. Stage 4. It's terminal." Claire gripped the edge of the counter. "What do you want?" "I saw Leo," Gregory said. "He came to my office last year, told me who he was." "I know," she said quietly. Silence. I think I need to see him again. One last time. And maybe you too. I don't know what I'm asking. Just, can we talk, please?" Claire didn't respond. She couldn't. He coughed, harsh and raw. "I'm at Lenox Hill, the oncology wing." The call ended. She stared at the phone for a long time before sliding it back into her pocket. That evening, Claire sat across from Leo at their favorite diner, one they always visited when he was home for weekends. She hadn't planned to tell him, but he noticed the look on her face before they even ordered. "Mom?" "He called me," she said, staring down at her cup of tea. "Gregory, he's dying." Leo leaned back, silent for a beat. "I figured something was wrong when I saw him. He didn't look well, but he still had that wall up, like nothing could reach him." Claire nodded. "He wants to see us, both of us, one last time." Leo ran a hand through his hair. "Do you want to go?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "I thought I closed that chapter, burned the pages even, but I keep thinking maybe there's value in letting him see what he missed, what he threw away." Leo's eyes met hers. "Then let's do it, together." They walked into the hospital 3 days later, just past dusk. The air inside was sterile, humming with fluorescent lights and the faint scent of antiseptic. Claire's heart raced with every step they took toward room 408. She didn't know what she expected: regret, denial, another cruel dismissal, but she had braced herself for all of it. Gregory looked almost unrecognizable. The once dominant tycoon now sat propped up in a narrow hospital bed, his skin pale, frame gaunt, eyes sunken with exhaustion. Tubes snaked from his arms. An oxygen tank hissed softly at his side. He looked up as they entered, and for a moment the breath left his chest, not from disease, but something else. Recognition, memory, time crashing down all at once. Claire didn't say anything. Neither did Leo. Gregory broke first. "You both came." His voice was softer now, less certain. Claire studied him, trying to find even a trace of the man she once loved, the man who abandoned her like yesterday's news. All she saw now was a man facing the end with nothing but silence in his corner. Leo moved first, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "I didn't come for closure," he said. "I got that when I walked out of your office. I came because my mom wanted to be here. And because maybe part of me needed to know if you were even capable of saying sorry." Gregory swallowed. "I am." Claire sat down slowly. Her voice was steady, but edged with years of ice. "Then say it." Gregory closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, tears were there. Real ones, not the kind conjured for manipulation or drama. "I was wrong," he said. "About everything. About you, Claire. About Leo. I let fear run my life. I chose my reputation over love. I thought I could erase my mistakes by walking away. But all I did was carve out a life of loneliness, and I deserve every second of it." The words hung in the room, heavy and strange. Claire looked at him. For the first time, she didn't feel anger. She didn't feel pity either. She felt distance, the kind that years, choices, and silence build. "I didn't need your apology," she said. "Not for me, I already healed. But maybe my son deserved to hear it." Gregory turned to Leo. "You've done more with your life than I ever dreamed. I read about your scholarship, the tutoring program you started. You're a better man than I ever was. And I wanted you to know that I see it. I see you." Leo didn't speak right away. When he finally did, his voice was calm, measured. "I'm not who I am in spite of you, Gregory. I'm who I am because of my mother. She gave me everything. Love, strength, sacrifice. You gave me a void I had to fill on my own, but I filled it." Gregory blinked hard, tears slipping down the sides of his face. "Can you ever forgive me?" Leo looked at Claire. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "I already did," he said. "Not for you. For me. So I could live without dragging your absence behind me like a chain." Gregory's breathing grew heavier, his shoulders sagging. "Thank you," he whispered. They didn't stay much longer. There wasn't anything else to say. No reconciliation to force. No need to pretend a relationship where none had ever existed. When they left the room, Claire paused at the door, looking back one last time. He looked so small, so quiet. A man at the end of the line, haunted not by ghosts, but by the living he had let go. Back outside, the city felt strangely gentle. The traffic muted, the air still. Claire and Leo walked in silence for a block before he spoke. "That was heavy." She nodded. "Yeah." "Do you regret going?" She thought about it, really thought, then shook her head. "No. I wanted him to see what love looks like. I wanted him to see you. That was always what he missed." Leo slipped his hand into hers. She squeezed it. And just like that, they walked forward. Not because of forgiveness, not because of closure, but because that's what people do when they've already won their battles and lived to tell the story. The funeral was quiet. Gregory Lancaster had lived a loud life. Headlines, boardrooms, gala events where the wine never stopped flowing. But in the end, the final chapter of his story closed in near silence. No press, no cameras, just a scattering of colleagues, a few distant family members, and the two people who had once been strangers to him, Claire and Leo. Claire stood a few feet from the polished casket, arms crossed gently in front of her. She didn't cry. She didn't feel rage either. What she felt was a strange stillness, the kind that follows a storm that lasted too long, the kind that makes you realize the winds have stopped not because they spared you, but because you survived them. Leo stood beside her, tall and composed, his expression unreadable. He had always been good at that, holding emotion like water in a still glass. Gregory's attorney had called a few days after his passing with a message. Gregory had left everything to Leo, his company shares, his personal estate, and perhaps most surprising of all, his journals. Claire had wanted to say no. She didn't want anything from him, not now, not ever. But Leo had insisted on collecting them. Not for the money, he said, for the truth. They left the funeral early, skipping the reception. Leo carried the box of journals out with him, tucked beneath one arm like a relic. Back in their small Brooklyn apartment, Leo sat at the dining table for hours, flipping through pages filled with tidy cursive and ink that had bled into the paper with age. Claire stayed in the kitchen, pretending to do dishes, though her hands had stopped moving long ago. Eventually, Leo spoke. "He was lonelier than I thought," he said. "His words, they're not excuses, but they're not nothing." Claire dried her hands slowly. "Did it help? Reading it?" Leo nodded, eyes still on the journal. "Yeah, it helped me realize he was a man, not a monster. He was weak, scared. That doesn't make what he did right, but it makes it real, and that makes it easier to let go." Claire stepped over and placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "You've always been better than him, Leo. Not because you forgave him, but because you never let his absence define you." Leo smiled up at her, the smile that always reminded her of his childhood. Soft, wide, pure. "I learned from the best." The inheritance remained untouched for weeks. Claire wanted nothing to do with it. Leo didn't need it. He was on track to graduate with honors, had a job offer lined up from a nonprofit think tank, and already had 2 research papers published. But there was something symbolic about it. Gregory had spent a lifetime hoarding wealth and control, believing power could shield him from regret. And now, that very wealth sat untouched, waiting to be repurposed. Leo made the decision one morning over coffee. "I want to start a scholarship," he told Claire, "for single mothers, kids like me. It won't fix what he did, but maybe it'll do some good." Claire blinked. "You'd name it after him?" Leo shook his head. "No, I'd name it after you." The Claire Donovan Foundation launched 6 months later, starting with just 3 scholarships and a small office space near Midtown. But within a year, it had grown into something much larger. Donations came in from people moved by the story, people who had heard about the son who forgave, the mother who fought, and the man who left behind a fortune he could never take with him. Claire stayed out of the spotlight. She never liked attention. But she visited the foundation often, watching from the wings as young mothers with tired eyes and hopeful voices walked through the doors. Some held babies in their arms. Others held dreams on their shoulders. All of them reminded her of herself. One day, Leo invited her to a small ceremony at Columbia. She assumed it was another student awards event, the kind she quietly attended just to beam at her son from the crowd. But when she arrived, the dean greeted her at the door with a smile and a program that made her breath catch. Keynote speaker, Claire Donovan, A Legacy of Resilience. She looked at Leo, stunned. "I can't do this," she whispered. "You already have," he said softly. "Just speak from your heart, like you always did with me." So she did. Her hands trembled as she stepped up to the podium, a spotlight warming her face. But as she scanned the room, rows of students, faculty, parents, she found Leo's eyes in the crowd and grounded herself there. "I was 19 when I met Gregory Lancaster," she began, "and I was 28 when I realized I had survived him." She told them about the penthouse, about the night she was thrown out with nothing but a duffel bag and a baby growing inside her. She told them about Cleveland, Marie, Donna's diner, and Leo's first steps across a faded apartment floor. She didn't cry. She didn't dramatize. She told the truth. And when she finished, the room rose in a standing ovation. Afterward, an older man approached her. His hair was white, his eyes kind, his granddaughter tucked at his side. "You reminded me of my wife," he said. "She raised 3 kids after I got drafted and never once let them feel the absence. Thank you." Claire nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you for saying that." On the cab ride home, Leo reached across the seat and took her hand. "You've spent so many years carrying everyone," he said. "I think it's time you realize you've arrived." She didn't answer. She just squeezed his hand. As the months passed, Claire began to feel something unfamiliar. Freedom. Not the kind that comes from a lack of responsibility, but the kind that grows in the space where regret used to live. She walked more. Painted again. Cooked meals, not out of necessity, but out of joy. Sometimes she visited schools and spoke to young women who reminded her of herself. And every time one of them looked at her like she was something other than broken, like she was a lighthouse in their storm, she felt herself standing taller. Gregory's shadow had once covered her life like a storm cloud, but now the sun broke through in ways he never could have imagined. One evening, as summer settled over Brooklyn and the breeze carried the smell of barbecues and blooming lilacs, Claire sat on the balcony with a book in her lap and a mug of tea in her hand. Leo was across from her, typing away on his laptop, working late on a new proposal for the foundation. "You know," he said without looking up, "I was thinking about writing a book, about everything. Your story, our story." Claire smiled, tucking her feet beneath her. "You think people would want to read it?" "I think people need to read it." She looked out over the city, the same city that once swallowed her whole, and now stood like a backdrop to a life fully lived. "Then write it," she said. "But make sure they know one thing." "What's that?" "That you were always the best chapter." Leo grinned. And the lights of the city twinkled below, like 1,000 open pages, just waiting for their next story to begin. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this powerful story. If you're still here, it means something in Claire and Leo's journey touched your heart, and we're so grateful for that. This story wasn't just about a betrayal or a comeback. It was about resilience, about the strength it takes to start over when the world turns its back on you. It's a reminder that you don't need wealth or titles to create a legacy. Sometimes the greatest triumphs are found in quiet sacrifices, in love that refuses to give up, and in the courage to forgive, not for others, but for your own peace. Where are you watching from today? We'd love to know. And if this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of someone you love, please subscribe to our channel. We're here to bring you more unforgettable stories of strength, healing, and the human spirit. Tap that bell so you never miss our next video, because the world needs more stories like this. And maybe, so do you.